So I find it interesting that there are points in our life, and I think it probably happens for everybody, that there are different people that can kind of come in and out of our life. And sometimes those people can have a very significant moment within our life. And there's a chance that sometimes a person can kind of come into your life, something can happen between you, they can help you, serve you, do something for you, and it really kind of affects you in a powerful way. And sometimes those people are kind of gone then. You know, you may not see them again. You may not come across them. Your paths may not cross. There's a lady that I would say is like that in our family's life, and her name is Diet Reel. Now, Diet is a midwife with the Duke University Health Systems. That's where she serves now, but about 9 years ago, she was working with the Pitt County Memorial Hospital in Greenville, North Carolina, and she is the woman that delivered our daughter, Allie. I'll never forget this night, that it was, I guess, around 12:30 in the morning. Beth very rudely woke me up from a nice sleep and told me that her water had broken. And of course, I very sensitively asked her, did anything get on the bed? And so after that, after she was done murdering me, we got out of the bed, and I remember scurrying around and rushing to get dressed real quick. We called our friend Amanda to come and stay the night at our house with our son Brennan. He was still sleeping, had no idea what was going on. We then got in my hunk-a-junk truck and drove the 20 minutes to the hospital. I probably ran a couple red lights because, hey, it's the middle of the night. No one's there to see it, right? We get to the hospital, and I was able to find a parking space, not too much trouble because of being so late. And we get in there, and we're filling out paperwork, and unfortunately, I'm not allowed to fill out any paperwork. And so my poor wife is there with these intense contractions, doubled over at the desk trying to sign these papers, and the heartless lady there working at the counter didn't really have much compassion for her. But we finally get into a delivery room, and Diet shows up and begins to kind of talk through what's going to be going on. I even called my parents and Beth's parents up here in Hampton Roads and told them, hey, it's time. And so they had a 3-hour drive, and Brennan took, I guess, about 10 hours to finally be delivered. And so they thought, oh, we got plenty of time. And Diet gets there and starts talking through everything. And Beth had planned to have an epidural for this delivery. But when Diet got there, she said, I'm sorry, you are too far along. This is moving too quickly. And she said, I can order the epidural, but there's a good chance that by the time they get it here and they get it all ready, you're already gonna deliver. And so Beth prepared for the delivery of this baby in an unexpected way. And all of this whole experience, I will never forget this whole experience, everything that went on that night. But there was a moment that is just kind of like embedded in my memory that I will vividly always remember. And it's when Diet looked Beth in the eye and said, this is gonna burn like fire. And I was like, I need to leave. I was like, I don't know if I can handle being in this room right now. But it was awesome because Diet coached her along, was there and helped her along, encouraged her, and next thing we knew, Allie was there in no time at all. In fact, I texted my parents and Beth's parents and said she's here, and it all happened so fast that they had no clue who I was even talking about when I said she's here, because my parents hadn't even left their home yet out there in Yorktown. But this was an incredible moment. It was a scary, exciting, emotional moment, all of these things. And the thing was that a few days later, we left the hospital and went home. And then as you do, a couple days later, about a week or so, we had to come back for Allie to be checked, Beth be checked, all that stuff. And so we saw Diet again. That's when we got this picture of them. And then that was it. We really didn't see her anymore. Beth and her are friends on Facebook, but I don't really know that we really keep up with her other than just seeing posts and things like that. And, and we really haven't kept in touch with where she is. Didn't even realize that she had moved hospital systems until I kind of was looking through it for this message. And that's not even to mention the doctor that delivered Brennan. We didn't even meet him until moments before Brennan was about to be delivered, and he walked in and snapped on the gloves and was ready to go. That was the first time we ever met him, and haven't seen him since. But there are these people that kind of like come into our lives, right? And they have these significant moments. They have a huge impact. There is something that touches us from them, what they do for us, and then they're gone. And then that's kind of it. Well, today we're going to look at two ladies in the Old Testament that I think had a similar situation with a lot of boys in the Israelite community. Now, we're in this series, Hidden Figures, and we're looking at some lesser-known ladies of the Bible. We're looking at some people. There are some names of women in the Bible that we know and very familiar with, but then there are some other women in the Bible that we don't really know all of their story. Last week, we looked at the very first one, Rizpah, and we saw how she did everything she could for her family, of protecting her sons, even after their death, of fighting off wild animals and birds to protect their bodies, even after they had died. And today, we continue on by looking at two ladies by the name of Shiphrah and Puah. Now, these ladies, Shiphrah and Puah, they were midwives, and these ladies, they had a significant impact, a powerful moment with so many Israelite boys in Egypt. And there's a good chance that not a single one of these boys ever met these two ladies. And we find them in the very first chapter of the book of Exodus. If you want to turn there in your own Bibles, you can. We'll be there in a moment. We'll also have the text up on the screen. But let me kind of give you some context as we lead up to this moment and kind of get an idea of where we are. If you go to the book before Exodus, if you go to the book of Genesis, and if you go towards the end of Genesis, you find the life of Joseph. And there's a lot worked into Joseph's life. If you've never read Joseph's life, the story of his life, I would encourage you to do that. There's some amazing things of how God used circumstances and weaved things together to bring about his plan and his purposes. So much so that Joseph was hated by his brothers, sold into slavery, and eventually God would use that beginning to bring him all the way to the point where Pharaoh invested so much trust and loyalty to Joseph that he actually moves Joseph to the place and elevates him to a place of basically second only to himself, the king of Egypt. And God uses Joseph in this position to save nations from a famine that comes on the land. And because God uses Joseph in this way, he saves not only the Israelite people, but he saves so many other nations. This foreigner, this outsider, God uses him. But then, after that, something happened. And that's what brings us to Exodus chapter 1 now. It's in verse 1 we pick up. It says this. These are the names of the sons of Israel. Israel is another name for Jacob, who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And then this is kind of really an important kind of switch over right here to this next verse. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So let's kind of get what's happened here so we really understand the situation. Joseph, the son of Israel, or the son of Jacob, he settles with all of his family, all of his brothers and all their family members in the land of Egypt. And while they're there, their families just kind of explode. They multiply. They just are so numerous. And after a while, this new king, long after Joseph and his brothers have all died, this new king comes into power, and he doesn't know the stories. For some reason, no one's told him the stories of how God used Joseph to save so many people. And so Joseph, the name Joseph, means nothing to this new king. And this new king sees how all these outsiders who are still there are becoming so numerous that he feels threatened because of it all. So we pick up in verse 11. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So this king, again, he doesn't know Joseph, doesn't know the importance, doesn't know Joseph's God, doesn't know how he had blessed Pharaoh and cared for Egypt through Joseph. He comes to power, he feels threatened, and he tries to do something about them. He tries to oppress them, but God sees this oppression and he blesses them even more. And this king, he continues to feel overwhelmed and threatened. And it gets to a point now in verse 15. It says, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. So this king, he's feeling threatened. He feels overwhelmed. His solution is, instead of continuing to live in peace with God's people, instead of living in peace with the Israelites and being a combined people, his solution first is to overwork and oppress these people and try and hold them down. But when that didn't work, he resorts now to murdering boys, murdering newborn baby boys. But the thing was, it wasn't by his own hands. He wasn't going to get his own hands dirty. Instead, he tells these midwives, these ladies, to do it for them. Now, my guess is that there were probably more than just these two midwives. There were probably a lot of midwives. I mean, if the Israelites were so numerous and having so many kids that they were growing this much, there were probably a lot more than just two midwives, like running around the nation trying to get all these kids born. But they probably represent all of these different midwives. And Pharaoh he demands that as they're delivering these children, that if it's a girl, let the girl live, but if it's a boy, to kill him. And the thing about this is that they're being instructed, they're being told to do this. This wasn't like a matter of personal struggle for them. This wasn't like a temptation for them. Never did these midwives ever find themselves thinking, man, we've got way too many babies, we better do something about this. I mean, that's what they lived for. That's who they were, about helping these mothers give birth. It was so important. And in fact, there's a very good chance that these midwives probably had no families of their own. A lot of times, the midwives would be barren women. And not only does that mean that they didn't have a family, the blessing of a family, but also meant that in those days, they had no one to support them. They had no legacy to leave for their family. This was a big deal. And these women, Pharaoh tries to get them to carry out his detestable plan. And if we think about our own lives, while I don't know that you and I are ever going to have a request maybe this severe and this terrible, we will be asked to compromise. You and I, at some point in our life, we will be asked to compromise. There will be times that you and I will be asked to do something that we know is not right. There are many times that those compromises that are even asked of us, they really aren't even for our own benefit. They do nothing for us. They may benefit someone else, and someone may try and tell us that it's a good thing for us to do. But there is going to be those moments in our life, young and old, no matter who you are. I mean, just think about it for our teenagers for a second. In school, there's going to be times that someone's going to ask you to allow them to cheat, and ask you for something for you to lie for them to make sure that they can get an assignment finished because maybe they were too lazy about whatever it is. And it doesn't benefit you in any way, only that other person. Maybe for our adults within your work setting, there's going to be a time that you might be asked to cover for someone or take responsibility for an issue that someone else has. Within our family, there's going to be these times within our families that we might be asked to ignore or lie about something that they just don't want to deal with and they don't want to have to worry about, and for us to then take that responsibility on us. We can feel this pressure to compromise sometimes. And unfortunately, at times, it can feel like if we don't give in, if we don't do what's being asked of us, it can feel like the outcome is a whole lot worse than maybe what we're going through right now. And so we feel that pressure. If I don't give in to my friends, I might lose my friends. I might lose these connections. If I don't give in to my coworkers, well, maybe I'll be missed for different opportunities of advancement. If I don't give in to my family, maybe they won't speak to me. They won't want to be a part of my life anymore. And we can be so convinced that if I just do this, maybe it won't be as bad. But we find the outcome is even more painful. You see, we can't determine the goodness of something based on the outcome and how it will affect us. We have to determine it based on God's truth. And what I mean is that we don't look inwardly and we think, okay, well, how's this going to make me feel? How's this going to benefit me later on? What's this going to be like later on? We have to look to God. We have to look to God and His Word and trust His Spirit. In James 4, James writes, he says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. These ladies, they didn't decide that their actions, they didn't decide how they would act based on just how it would affect them. I mean, because they were probably being threatened. They knew that this could potentially mean something very bad for them, but that's not how they decided what they were going to do. They decided based on God's standards. And the way that I know that is we see in verse 17 now. It says, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. You see, friends, the fear of God has to be our guide. The fear of God has to be our guide. Now, when we say that they feared God, I think sometimes we think about different ways that we might fear God. On the one hand, you can fear God and be afraid of what might happen to you if I do something wrong. I mean, very potentially, they might have kind of counted the cost and thought, okay, if we do what the king says, I'm going to face repercussions from God. But then if we don't do what the king says, we have to face the repercussions from the king. And they have to kind of decide which one is worse. Which one are we going to, be more afraid of? Or maybe when it said that they feared God, maybe it was more of their fear of God was a respect of him and a respect of his design for life, which is what they did. They respected God, they honored God, they feared God, and that dictated their decisions. We fear losing friends. We fear embarrassing ourselves. We fear of getting looked over for promotions or being neglected at work. We feel of hurting our family members' feelings. We fear of not measuring up to maybe what some people might think that we should measure up to. But in Matthew 10, Jesus says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Jesus tells us, don't let your fear be wrapped up in people and what you think that they might be able to do to you, but instead fear God and allow your respect, your trust, your honor of God and his design for life to be what guides your decisions. The Bible has a lot to say about us fearing God. In Proverbs 9:10, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Elsewhere in Exodus, in chapter 20 and verse 20, it says, Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. In Deuteronomy 6:1, it says, these are the commands and decrees of the laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that your children and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as they live by keeping these decrees and commands that I have given you, so that they may enjoy a long life. Proverbs 14:2, whoever fears the Lord walks uprightly. Proverbs 16:6, through the fear of the Lord evil is avoided. And even Luke 1:50, his mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. You see, the fear or the respect, the commitment to God and his standard, that's what motivated these ladies, Shiphrah and Puah, to act in this way, to take this risk, to put themselves on the line for what God had called them to. And it needs to be the same thing for us as well. Let's go back to our Exodus passage now. In verse 18, it says, then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. They don't get an epidural either, I guess. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. These ladies, they stand in fear of the evil. They stand in terror. They stand in face of that evil, and they're saying, we're not going to give in to that. And they stand in the face of harm against these children. And did you catch what the results were of that at the end there? I mean, the thing that jumps out to me is that very last thing, that God gave them families of their own. I mean, that's huge. I mean, again, just the blessing of them knowing that they had a family like that, the support, the love of a family. But again, like I said earlier, in those days, what that meant so much more to them, of being able to be provided for, of even have a legacy, their name carried on. But not only that, not only was it a blessing for these ladies, and not only did God honor them and bless them because of what they did, but it also said that the number of the people continued to increase. That means Pharaoh's plan was thwarted, and it failed, and they became even more numerous after all this. You see, God blesses when we stand for him. I really believe that God blesses when we stand for him. Now, I didn't say God takes away all the bad things when we stand for him, right? Or God gives you everything you want when you stand for him. Or God will give you a raise when you stand for him. Or God will give you a nicer car or a nicer house. Or God will give you well-behaved children if you stand. God, that's not the promise. God does bless. But sometimes we, I think, confuse our humanly desires and the things that we want for what God is blessing us with and what we think God should be blessing us with. But I mean, even in Matthew 5, it's recorded what Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." You see, we may not see down the road what the blessing is that God has in store for us. And the truth is, that blessing may not even come within this life, but that blessing will come for us. Maybe it's the day we come face to face with our Lord. We can trust that when we faithfully stand for God, for his truth, for his standards, he will bless us. Now, I wish we could just say that that's like the end of the story, right? I wish we could kind of put a period on it and move on with it. Now, that's the end of the story of Shiphrah and Puah. Their storyline ends there, but that's not the end of Pharaoh's story and the Israelites' story. If you see in verse 22, it says, "Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." And so even though Shiphrah and Puah, even though they took their stand, they did this scary and dangerous and fearful thing of standing up to Pharaoh and saying no and not doing what he said, even though they did this incredible and awesome and important thing, standing for these children who could not stand for themselves and defend themselves. And even though you and I, we may stand up, we may step in and face evil and choose God's standards for us in our school places, in our workplaces, in our families, friends, the hard truth is that evil still persists. Evil still persists, even in the face of us trusting in God and doing what he's called us to do. Pharaoh saw that he couldn't kill these boys with the help of these midwives. So did you catch who he told to do it for him? He told all his people. He enlists everyone in this, what I think is an even greater evil, calling his people to murder these boys just because they were Hebrew boys. Evil persists. In fact, if you even go on to the next chapter there in Exodus, you see the life of Moses, the story of his life starting. And it was kind of a similar situation where his mother, Jochebed, is afraid of what may happen to her son. So she hides him, puts him into the reeds. God guides him because God's got a plan of what he's going to do for him. But even still in that situation, evil persists. And sadly, when you and I, when we stand for God, sure, he's going to bring his blessings, but it's sad to say that even still, evil will persist. But we can't stop in doing good. We can't stop in standing for God just because of that. In fact, in Galatians 6, Paul writes and says, "Let us not become weary. Let us not wear out. Let us not give up in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." You see, this isn't a one-time thing of standing up for God and his truth and his standards. This isn't a short-term effort. This is an over and over, every day, every situation kind of thing. And so what I want to do is I want to finish up this time by giving you 3 ways that we can try and do this, that we can try and stand on God's truth, that we can try and stand on his standards. And the first way I want to encourage us to do it is don't stand alone. Don't stand alone. I love the fact that we see these 2 ladies mentioned, that it wasn't just one midwife that was mentioned that represented all of them, but it was 2 of them that were mentioned. They had each other. I mean, who knows the conversations that they were having leading up to this? Like, can we do this? Are you serious? I mean, this is like one of those made-for-TV kind of moments that I would love to have seen, the conversations, the fear that went into it, but also the encouragement that they had to each other of saying, we're going to do this together. We cannot underestimate the importance and the power of support when we have people in our lives. I mean, that's why it's so important that we know, even what was talked about a few weeks ago, of us seeing each other as a church family, that we are together in this. The writer of Ecclesiastes kind of talked about this dynamic of having people to support you. And he says this in Ecclesiastes 4:10. He says, if either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. You know, and I want to especially say this to our young people, to our teenagers in the room. You know, there are those moments. I can remember in high school, a long time ago, I can remember thinking that I was the only one, that I was the only teenager who was a Christian and trusted God. But the thing is that over time, you know, it kind of happens that people find out that you're a Christian and they're like, oh, you're a Christian too? Oh, you go to church too? And I can't tell you the relief that came over me when I realized I was not the only one. And that there were others out there that were probably going through the same kind of wrestling and same kind of questions and struggles and frustrations as what I was going through as well. And friends, it also is true for us in our adult lives too. That there are those moments that we can find ourselves in conversations and situations where we think we're the only ones, right? That there's no one else out there. And as we are brave enough and confident enough in God for us to be able to say His truth and stand for His truth and share with people, the more we find others who are probably feeling that same way as well and just need someone else to be the first one. Friends, don't try and do this alone. Recognize there are people with you. But the second thing I want to encourage you to do is don't look for the easy route. And I'm sorry to say that. You know, the easy route oftentimes is not what God has called us to. Because so often in these situations, we default to the things that the least resistance, the least ridicule, the least embarrassment, the least tension, the least fight. But so often, it's not that we're looking for a fight, not we're looking for an argument, but so often it is standing up and standing against the things that are around us. Jesus said in 1 John, or actually John said in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. It may be easier. It may be more comfortable. It may be simpler to just go along with whatever's happening around us. But in the end, the results is that we will suffer for it. And it won't be what God called us to. And we won't see what God has designed us for and prepared us for on the other side. The last thing I want to encourage you with is to stand on God's truth, is to make that be what we stand on. You know, I think so often as Christians, sometimes we stand on preferences. You know, we stand on ideas. We stand on traditions. We stand on things we're used to. And sometimes they line up with God's truth, and that's great when that happens, but sometimes maybe they don't. And so I want to encourage us not to be so wrapped up about my feelings about things or so wrapped up on my thoughts about things, but instead to stand on God's truth. In Matthew 7, Jesus said, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine, hears them and puts them into practice, is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. We need the bedrock foundation in our life to be built on. We need our lives to be built on God's truth so that we can take a stand, so that we can stand strong and stand tall and stand long when these hardships come our way. And so that means the way that we do that is that we need to be in God's Word. We need to be shooting for that every single day, an opportunity to be in God's Word, to kind of plant ourselves on His truth, on His Word every day. Not just Sundays when I'm up here preaching, but every day of our life. Finding time, making time to be in the Bible, to be in His Word, so that we can be like that wise builder and we can build our lives on God's truth. Who knows? You know, maybe if we stand strong on God's truth, and maybe if we stand strong for God's truth, maybe we will be like those ladies, Shiphrah and Puah, for someone else. You know, maybe we will have an impact in someone else's life. Maybe we will be the one who steps in and stands for God's truth, God's standards, and makes a difference and touches someone in their life because we were willing to stand for God, because we were willing to stand for his standard. Let me pray for us. Lord, we thank you so much for these kinds of examples that we see in your word. Sometimes we can feel like we get into situations and maybe we feel like no one knows what I'm going through. No one knows what I'm facing. No one knows the struggles, the temptations, the hardships, the things that I have to deal with. But then we stop and we look at your word and we see people
Church, let's all stand. We're going to lift it up with this last song.